Humans have the capacity to even make the devil look kinder. The history of human slavery is a testament to that, and we've been asked to ignore it for decades. Join us as we uncover the disturbing horrors of black male slaves by white women in this video. The history of slavery in America is long and dark. Human-chattel slavery was both legal and prevalent from the colonial era through the Antebellum period, with Africans and African Americans being forced to labor. From physical punishments to sexual abuse, slaves had to endure it all just so they could get food in 1 or 2 days. However, even though most of the recorded evidence of this period points towards the hardship that female black slaves had to go through, the abuse that black male slaves endured at the hands of elite white women is disturbing as well. Slavery was introduced by British colonizers in America in the early 17th century. Within several decades of being brought to the American colonies, Africans were stripped of human rights and enslaved as chattel, an enslavement that lasted more than 2 centuries. The clergy preached that slavery was the will of God. Scientists proved that black people were less evolved, a subspecies of the human race. It became so common that by the 18th century, roughly 1 in every 6 people was a slave. It was common to buy, sell, and trade these slaves at the convenience of their masters. After Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793, it dramatically increased the speed at which cotton could be processed. This, in turn, led to a surge in cotton production. With a newfound efficiency, cotton became a highly profitable cash crop for Southern planters. The expansion of cotton cultivation created a greater demand for labor, and slave labor was seen as the most economical solution. As the plantation economy expanded, slave auctions, where enslaved individuals were publicly sold to the highest bidder, became common in the southern states. This gave birth to slave brutality that continued till the Antebellum South period era. The term antebellum is made of 2 words. Ante means before, and bellum means war. It refers to the period before the American Civil War, roughly spanning from the late 18th century to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, which ultimately ended slavery. During the slavery era, female slaves were mostly hired out to work in white households, performing tasks such as cooking, cleaning, and child care, whereas male slaves were assigned more physically demanding tasks. Enslaved men and boys were hired to work in artisan trades, industries such as mining and manufacturing, where they weren't even given safety gear to protect themselves. Usually, the small to medium-sized plantation owners needed the slaves, but as the days passed, owning slaves became a status symbol. Soon, the large-scale plantation owners started employing them, and contrary to popular belief, most of the slave owners were white women. To them, it was prestige to own slaves. And the more slaves they owned, the more wealthy they were considered. This class of women was known as the planter class. It was a specific group of women who belonged to the elite plantation-owning class in the southern states of America. These plantation owners mostly focused on cash crops like tobacco, cotton, coffee, and rubber trees. As the conditions were harsh to work in, the government had to import as much as black slaves as they could. A formerly enslaved man named Caesar remembers the iron entered into our souls. He tells how the shackles he had to wear during his forced passage from his home in Africa to the New World, used as restraints around the arms and legs. The coarse metal cut into captive African skin for the many months they spent at sea. Because governments determined by the ton how many people could be fitted onto the slave ship, enslavers prioritized children. They could fill the boat's small spaces, allowing more human capital in the cargo hold. Africans were crammed into ships with no knowledge of where they were going or if they would be released. This forced migration is known as the Middle Passage. As Olado Equiano, the formerly enslaved author, remembered, "I was soon put down under the decks, And there, I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life. So that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wish for the last friend, death, to relieve me. The torture that black male slaves faced on the farms. Before cotton became the dominant crop in American agriculture, sugar fueled the slave trade across the Caribbean and Spanish Americas. Sugar cane cultivation was grueling, demanding, constant work 6 days a week, and causing injuries, burns, and fatalities among those involved. Enslaved individuals on sugar plantations faced a drastically shortened lifespan, sometimes as little as 7 years. Plantation owners, undeterred by the high mortality rate, worked their enslaved laborers relentlessly and anticipated this high turnover by ensuring a constant influx of new enslaved people to replace those who died. The sentiment was encapsulated by British poet William Cowper, who remarked, "I pity them greatly, but I must be mum, for how could I do without sugar or rum?" If they were her property, white women as slave owners in the American South, Stephanie E. Joan Rogers highlights how those wealthy plantation owners used the trope of innocent white womanhood to sway juries. At that time, though white women didn't have as many rights as white men, they still had the right to buy and sell human property. The author bursts the myth that white women were passive bystanders to the slave economy in the U.S. Instead, she demonstrates their active participation in its structures of brutality and exploitation. The pure and innocent reputation of white women was often used to torture male slaves. Just like how female slaves were expected to fulfill the desires of their masters, male slaves also had to follow each and every order of their mistress. This included male slave owners using sexual assault to dominate, dehumanize, and emasculate male slaves in the American Antebellum South. As Thomas Foster wrote in his article, The Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under American Slavery, black manhood under slavery was also violated in other ways that are less easily spoken of then and now, namely the sexual exploitation of enslaved men. Like women, enslaved men were also punished sexually to discipline them, and if any slave dared to resist or escape, the white woman used to play her innocence card and accuse the enslaved man of assaulting her. As Leon F. Litwack in 1998 recalled those of Scout Finch, for a black man, a sexual advance to a white woman was a certain invitation to a tortured death. Rape of a white woman by a black slave was indeed a capital crime in Virginia, as well as in the rest of the slaveholding South during the 19th century. However, attempted rape was not punishable by death in Virginia. Instead, the slaves convicted of attempting to rape white women were castrated. These harsh rules, combined with an unfair jury consisting of white, vocally racist men only, made it difficult for black male slaves to disobey the orders given by white women. Another way to punish the black male slaves was to separate them from their families and sell them. As the enslaved men and women were considered human property, it was not legal for them to get married. However, their owners did force them to reproduce, as having more black children as slaves meant being more rich. Now, it is crucial to understand why white women unleashed such brutality upon their slaves, especially male slaves. In recent studies of the economics of slavery, it is obvious that plantations were financially unstable places, bankrolled on credit, often intractably in debt, and subject to perennial bust of the system of transatlantic capitalism, of which plantation slavery was a crucial part. As Jones Rogers likes to put it, for women, independent wealth represented a bulwark against the financial risk their husbands assumed when they played the speculative cotton market. Should all be lost, at least their money would be safe. So would their status as dominant people. Slave ownership provided white women with a mechanism for joining their male counterparts in the ruling class, which might otherwise have been closed off to them. As female slaves were important to look after the children of white mistresses and productive slavery was more prevalent, male slaves were preferred due to the physical intensity of the labor and the perception that they were more likely to survive seasoning or acclimation to the new environment. Thus, white women found it easier to torture black men to establish psychological control over slaves. Despite the arguments of previous scholars trying to make white women slave owners look kind, the author of They Were Her Property argues that white women were actually trained to participate in slave trading from a very young age. Their exposure to the slave market is not something that begins in adulthood. It begins in their homes when they're little girls, sometimes infants, when they're given enslaved people as gifts, she says. Southern children of both genders grew up watching their parents exert mastery over black people and then mimic these behaviors. If They Were Her Property, the first chapter begins with Lizzie Ann Burwell, age 3, demanding her father cut Fanny's ear off, showcasing how slaves meant nothing to their owners. It is disturbing to know that even after the Civil War, Southern white women sought the capture of fugitive slaves who ran toward freedom behind Union lines, moved the enslaved away from encroaching federal army, or held them in local jails, or hid them in their homes to prevent their flight, and withheld the news of emancipation from them to prolong their captivity. They sought to recreate slavery through exploitative work contracts. Some also wrote books portraying the institution of slavery as gentle and benign. The most famous being Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, a woman born 35 years after abolition. A few white women went as far as to petition President Andrew Johnson for pardons, citing their losses in human property as a way of gaining sympathy. This interaction of racism and classism puts forth the overlooked hardships of black male slaves who suffered at the hands of white women.